Mark Thompson bought the condemned Victorian house on Maple Street after losing his job and reputation at his architectural firm. Local residents mocked his desperate man's folly, but Mark worked tirelessly to renovate the crumbling property that had supposedly destroyed 3 families. One evening, while removing damaged drywall, he discovered a hidden door sealed shut for decades. When he finally pried it open, the room's contents left him frozen in disbelief. The small town of Millfield had always prided itself on being a tight-knit community, where success was celebrated and failure was whispered about behind closed doors. Mark knew this all too well as he drove through the familiar streets that now felt so foreign to him. Just 3 months earlier, Mark had been the golden boy at Peterson & Associates, the town's premier architectural engineering firm. His designs had transformed the skyline of several neighboring cities, and his reputation for innovative solutions had made him somewhat of a local celebrity. Clients requested him by name, and younger architects studied his work with admiration. All of that came crashing down when a miscalculation in his designs for their biggest client, Westridge Developments, led to catastrophic budget overruns. The error wasn't discovered until construction had already begun, costing the client millions. The fallout was swift and merciless. Mark was let go after 15 years at the firm. Peterson publicly distanced themselves from him, placing all blame squarely on his shoulders. Former colleagues who had once sought his mentorship now crossed the street to avoid awkward encounters. The whispers followed him everywhere, at the grocery store, the local diner, even during his morning runs. Mark needed somewhere to retreat, somewhere affordable where he could rebuild his life away from judgment. His severance package was modest, certainly not enough to maintain his previous lifestyle for long. That's when he saw the listing for the old Victorian house on Maple Street. The property had been on the market for over 3 years, its price dropping steadily until it was now being offered for less than a third of other homes in the area. Mark had always admired the house from afar, noting its classic architectural features beneath years of neglect. The real estate agent, Helen Porter, seemed genuinely surprised when Mark called about the property. She reluctantly agreed to show him the house, explaining that she had a professional obligation to warn potential buyers about its history. As they walked through the creaking front door, Helen recounted the property's troubled past. 3 different families have purchased it over the past decade, each intended to renovate and flip it, but all eventually abandoned their plans and sold at a loss. She lowered her voice. The local rumor mill claims the house is cursed. More practically, Helen explained, engineers had identified serious foundation issues that would cost a fortune to repair. But as Mark moved through the space, his trained eyes saw something different. He noticed the quality of the original craftsmanship beneath the decay. Most importantly, he recognized that what others had identified as foundation problems were actually issues with the property's drainage system, a much simpler and less expensive fix. When Mark made an offer the next day, Helen confirmed it with a tone that suggested she thought he might be having a mental breakdown. News of his purchase spread quickly through Millfield. His brother called him that evening. "Are you really buying that disaster on Maple Street? It seems like you've truly hit rock bottom," his brother remarked. Mark simply explained that he saw potential where others saw problems, a philosophy that had once made him successful in his career. The day Mark moved in, he noticed neighbors slowing their cars as they passed, pointing at what locals had started calling his desperate man's folly. Some were bold enough to approach him directly. "The previous owner went bankrupt trying to fix the place," they warned. "Another developed health problems from the mold. The house is a money pit that will swallow whatever remains of your reputation and finances." Mark simply nodded politely and continued unloading his belongings. He had a plan, and he intended to follow it methodically. The renovation began with fixing the drainage problems around the foundation. Mark dug trenches by hand, installed proper drainage pipes, and regraded the soil around the house to direct water away from the structure. It was backbreaking work, but it addressed the root cause of many issues. With the water problems resolved, Mark moved on to the interior. He removed damaged drywall, treated areas affected by mold, and began restoring the original Victorian trim. He worked from sunrise to sunset, finding unexpected peace in the physical labor. Some days were harder than others. Occasionally, he would overhear residents discussing his pathetic situation as they walked past. "That house that destroyed 3 families is now destroying the disgraced architect," they said. Mark pushed these comments aside and focused on his work. After a month of intense labor, the exterior was starting to show signs of improvement. The sagging porch had been reinforced, the gutters replaced, and the yard cleared of decades of overgrowth. Still, most locals remained skeptical. They had seen others start renovations with enthusiasm, only to be defeated by the seemingly endless problems the house presented. Mark was undeterred. He worked his way through the interior room by room, carefully balancing restoration with necessary modernization. The kitchen and bathrooms were gutted and rebuilt. Original hardwood floors were sanded and refinished. Throughout the process, Mark documented everything meticulously, creating a portfolio that he hoped might eventually help him rebuild his professional reputation. One evening, while removing damaged drywall in what appeared to have been a study, Mark noticed something odd. The room's dimensions didn't quite match up with the exterior walls of the house. There seemed to be several feet of unaccounted space. Tapping along the wall, Mark heard a distinct hollow sound in one section. Curious, he made a small exploratory hole. Behind the drywall was an older layer of plaster, and behind that, he could see wooden paneling. Working carefully, Mark expanded the opening until he revealed what was unmistakably a door, one that had been sealed and plastered over decades ago. The door was locked, but the wood around the ancient hardware had rotted slightly. With a firm push, Mark broke through. The musty smell of long-sealed air rushed out as the door swung open, revealing a small room hidden from the world for decades. Mark's heart raced as he stepped into the darkness, his flashlight beam cutting through years of dust dancing in the air. The beam landed on shapes draped in yellowed cloth. With trembling hands, he pulled back the first cover. Wooden crates filled the space, methodically arranged and untouched for nearly a century. The first crate contained dozens of whiskey bottles, with labels dating back to the 1920s, their seals unbroken. Another held specialized glassware from speakeasies, notebooks with coded entries, and a modified cash register designed to hide money quickly. Vintage photographs showed men in suits standing in front of various buildings, some of which Mark recognized as still standing in the downtown Millfield. But the most intriguing find was a leather-bound journal belonging to Joseph Calhoun, a notorious bootlegger who had operated throughout the Midwest during Prohibition. Calhoun had mysteriously disappeared in 1929, with local legend claiming he had fled to Europe with his fortune when authorities closed in. But the contents of this hidden room told a different story. The journal contained detailed records of Calhoun's operations and locations of other hidden caches throughout the Midwest. Mark sat on the dusty floor, transfixed by the journal's pages, reading by flashlight until dawn broke. The next morning, Mark contacted the Historical Society. Within hours, experts arrived to authenticate the collection. Word spread rapidly through town. The house on Maple Street, the rejected property that everyone had mocked Mark for purchasing, contained what historians were calling the most significant Prohibition-era discovery in decades. News crews descended on Millfield. The local paper ran a front-page story featuring Mark standing proudly in front of the house that was no longer seen as a disaster, but as a historical treasure. Museum curators began cataloging the artifacts, while a prominent whiskey distillery offered a substantial sum for the vintage bottles. The town's attitude toward Mark transformed overnight. Those who had once pitied him now praised his vision. Former colleagues called to congratulate him. Neighbors who had mocked his renovation efforts now stopped by with offers to help with the remaining work. What no one in town knew was that Mark had discovered something else among Calhoun's possessions, something he hadn't shared with anyone. Hidden within the journal was a folded deed showing that Calhoun had legally purchased several undeveloped acres of land. Mark had studied the old property maps and made a startling discovery. Those acres now sat directly beneath Millfield's newly constructed luxury shopping mall. As Mark stood on his now restored Victorian porch, watching another news crew set up for an interview, he couldn't help but smile at the irony. Sometimes the worst failures lead to the greatest opportunities, if you have the courage to see potential where others see only problems.